I think we all know that the debate around the high cost of prescription drugs, pharmaceuticals, continues to generate more and more attention each day. We know the prescription drug spending is growing faster than any other part of the healthcare dollar. We need to think about some new approaches to prescription drug pricing that we know will strike a balance between innovation, affordability, how do we get the right incentives in place so that the market rewards technologies and new treatments. And to help answer these questions, I'm really pleased to introduce our next speakers to share their perspectives on making prescription drugs more affordable for all Americans. I'm going to keep their bios very brief. They need little introduction, but we want to make sure we have enough time for discussion with them. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who's a physician that needs no introduction, but he served as the 23rd Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Gottlieb's work focuses on advancing public health through developing and implementing innovative approaches to improving medical outcomes, reshaping healthcare delivery, and expanding consumer choice and safety. He serves on the board of Pfizer, Inc. and Illumina, Inc., and is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a partner at the venture capital firm New Enterprise Associates. And David Holmberg is president and chief executive officer of Highmark Health, a $21 billion blended healthcare organization that includes one of America's largest Blue Cross Blue Shield insurance providers and a growing regional hospital and physician network. Based in Pittsburgh, Highmark Health's 37,000 employees serve millions of customers nationwide through the nonprofits organizations affiliated businesses, including Highmark Inc., Allegheny Health Network, HM Insurance Group, United Concordia Dental, and HM Health Solutions. David also happens to serve as the chairman of the board of directors of AHIP. And thank you for joining us here today. Why don't we just jump right in to this discussion? And thank you. So we know, maybe I'll start with you, David. We know that there's a lot of resistance to almost every sector with respect to policies that could, lower prescription drug costs. And it seems that because, with every solution, someone feels like they have something to lose. I know we always want to try and find sort of win-win solutions. Do you think there are any out there in that way?
Well, the answer is yes, but before we get to that, why didn't you wear a tie?
I was admiring his sock game. I don't know.
His socks are good too.
Socks.
You didn't get the memo, did you?
I did not get the memo.
Okay.
I said no ties. It's Vegas.
Yeah. No, I think there are wins. I do believe Highmark is in a unique position because we do have the health system, and we've obviously are a significant payer. And we are seeing firsthand, the impact and value of innovation in the pharmaceutical world. Our challenge is how do we figure out how to make it affordable and make sure that we do it in a responsible way. And I do think there's more common ground than anybody realizes. I get, if every week I'll get a special case where it might be an individual that's a $2 million drug is a solution and changes their life. And we've got to figure out how to afford those and make them readily available to as many people as possible. But yeah, I think there is, and as you know, I'm a retailer, that's where I started my career. And in retail, you try to simplify the problems, you try to come up with easier solutions for consumers to say yes. And I think that's a big part of it. And we, collectively, need to all come to the table and figure out how to do that.
Yeah. So we know that it's always an issue around what consumers pay, out of pocket when they get to the pharmacy counter for a medication. And that's critically important because you don't want a patient to walk away from a prescription that they've been prescribed because of cost. At the same time, we know that we have issues and challenges with respect to, list prices, launch prices. I mean, do you think, and maybe Scott, you could jump in here, do you think that it's realistic to lower the cost for consumers if we're not going to address sort of like where the price is for prescription drugs?
Yeah, can I just pick up on the win-win?
Sure,
yeah,
please,
look,
absolutely.
I think that there's a lot of room for payers and the drug manufacturers be working more closely together. And I think that where the tension is and where the opportunity is that for a lot of drug makers, and I'm not speaking on behalf of Pfizer, I want to make that clear, even though I'm on the board. For a lot of drug makers, what you'll hear them say is that the ability to penetrate the market has gotten a lot more difficult. So when you look at the way they make projections, forecasts about their drugs, they always model peak revenues, and peak revenues used to be like year 2, and then it became year 3, and now it's year 6, and then your patent's up in year 10. So I think that there would be a willingness to make concessions on price for access. And I think everyone can win in that scenario because a payer can roll out a beneficial new drug more efficiently to their membership more quickly. Manufacturers might be willing to make concessions on price in that kind of a circumstance where they're getting market access earlier in the course of the drug life cycle. And so that's an area where I think there's a win-win. And I think the opportunity set is for payers to enter into arrangements with the manufacturers, and you see this happening on a one-off basis where there's risk sharing, where there's pay for performance, there's some kind of measurement, and I know there's challenges coming up with ways to measure a drug's performance in a reasonable period of time, and some of those models have been effective. I think the challenge has been kind of operationalizing it in a way it can become a repetitive type of scheme. On the issue of the list price, it is true that when you look at the list prices, they've actually come down in the last 4 years, about 1% every year. So they have been coming down. The net price, not the list prices. The list prices have gone up 5% a year on average the last 4 years. The net prices have come down about 1%. So the real price is coming down. Rebating is increasing, and the list price continues to go up. I think what the manufacturers would say to you is that, what they feel forced to do is push up the list price because they know that there's going to be mandatory discounting in public programs like Medicaid. They know that they're going to have to make concessions on rebates to try to buy access to formularies. And so there's this imperative in the marketplace to continue to push up the list price to give room for the mandatory rebating. And if the rebating went away, they could bring down the list price. That's what the manufacturers would argue, and that's what they argue in the context of the rebate rule. I think there's some truth to that. I don't think there's entire truth to that. If you do away with the rebating, you're not going to see all that money go back into reductions on the list price, and you're going to lose one form of price negotiation in the marketplace. And that's in fact why the Congressional Budget Office scored that rebate rule as costing money. But the list prices, I think, need to be addressed because that's what, to your point, that's what the patients are on the hook for. If they're out of pocket or they're uninsured, they're on the hook for the list price. And I think we need to find a way to address that issue, making sure we're not tying copays to list price, but we're tying it to the real price in the marketplace, and finding ways to try to buy down that out-of-pocket cost with the rebates at the pharmacy counter.
Mm-hmm. So we know that incentives matter. Right? I mean, it's really important to get the right incentives, whether it's around incentives to develop, new products so that the market rewards innovation and new treatments, but that we also need to make sure that we're looking at, the outcome, right? And we want to make sure that new drugs are delivering a better outcome, if possible, versus sort of existing therapies. Because that's when real value is delivered, right? If we're improving the sort of standard of care. How do you think about incentives, David, in sort of this context, and what do you think we should be thinking writ large as an industry?
Well, first of all, I think we need to have incentives that encourage that next generation of game-changing drugs, and we need to have agreement on like what the metrics are or what the expectations are. So stepping away from drugs for a second, you've seen in MRI machines and things where the next generation or the newest one is only delivering a 5% improvement in accuracy and effectiveness, but might have a 25% increase in the price of that particular machine. And and that's a mismatch. I mean, for long term. I think, like in our organization, we're totally willing to do what Scott just talked about: go at risk, partner on on truly transformational drugs, and then work together to try to find ways to make sure that we're incentivizing those. And again, I see it firsthand with real people and real patients who, you can change their lives. And so, we want to say yes. But I think it's going to take everybody at the table to deal with this. So we want to reward, significant advancements, and we want to figure out how to be more efficient with, existing, drugs, either using biosimilars, generics, whatever it might be. But we haven't even got into the genomics yet. I mean, I think there's a whole opportunity there.
I'll just say, picking up on that, I was back, and you remember, I was back at FDA in 2003 with Mark McClellan when a lot of these same issues were being debated back then. I remember that the issue back then was every drug company is just developing a Me Too drug. Everyone wants to be the 10th statin. And you saw a lot of that kind of follow-on innovation, and everyone bemoaned, why aren't drug makers trying to develop cures for intractable cancers and rare diseases? And there were deliberate policy decisions made, and one of them was creating that specialty tier in Medicare Part D, where we basically, and I was at CMS when we did this, and you remember it, right, where we basically protected the pricing in the specialty tier. We basically allowed companies to charge what they could in that specialty tier because it was all reinsured by the government, and that was somewhat deliberate. I mean, it was done for reasons of trying to get a good budget score, but it was also deliberate because we wanted to say, we're going to make it really competitive against good enough generics if you're just sort of a slightly better statin. But if you develop something truly breakthrough, you're going to have protected pricing. And sure enough, I mean, I'm not saying it's because of that policy, but at least in part because of it, you saw a dramatic shift in investment towards those kinds of innovations, and now we're at the point where we can't afford all the specialty drugs. So, the manufacturers do respond to these incentives, so that's why we need to be careful about the policy choices that we make.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. Scott, you mentioned some of the difficulties around getting to some of the value based contracting related issues. I mean, how do you think we should contemplate different approaches to assess a drug's value, right? Because there's what happens in the real world, there's what happens in a clinical trial, there's the potential long-term healthcare savings that are generated by a new therapy. There may be very large short-term costs. I mean, how do we need to sort of think about all these complicated moving parts?
Yeah, look, I think we have established tools for doing that. There's established sort of economic models for doing it. You see Eyles are applying a certain model. I think that there are policy judgments made in terms of how we apply these assessments. Eyles, I think, is very sort of conservative in assessing benefit because they believe that they're creating sort of a floor, not a ceiling. It's going to get negotiated up. So different groups make different policy judgments in terms of how they adjudicate the inputs. But quality adjusted life years. A lot of manufacturers will price based on what the prevailing price is in the marketplace for a drug. They'll come in at the same price with something that they think is delivering a better benefit. A lot of drug makers will price based on what they're offsetting. When Kymriah came into the market, the first CAR T therapy, which was approved when I was at FDA. I remember Novartis came in and talked to us about it. They said they were pricing it commensurate with what it cost to get a bone marrow transplant, which is what it was potentially obviating. But I think that the bottom line, though, is that, and you know this better than me, I mean, if you look out long enough, if you have a truly transformative treatment and you look out long enough, in terms of the economic costs, it's going to end up costing more because you're going to end up saving a life, prolonging a life, and incurring other costs along the way. And so, you have to factor in the value that's being delivered from helping someone live longer, live a more productive life.
And from a payer perspective, you've also got to factor in that some portion of the people, when you're paying up front, are going to change insurance in 3 to 5 years. And so that creates another interesting dynamic that that we have to figure out together.
Yeah, and I mean, so you mentioned earlier, some of the gene therapies, David, and maybe why don't we just go there now, because I think it's exactly what we're talking about, which is drugs with potentially transformative benefits, extraordinary treatment advances that potentially have the ability to cure, right? I mean, the question is, how do you determine a cure, over what period of time, is it durable? When we think about gene therapies and stem cell therapies, regenerative medicine, I mean, which new therapeutic technologies do you see holding the greatest promise? And Scott, this one's probably for you, but then second, how should we think about the economics and of course the outcomes of those types of products?
Well, look, I think that we're in the early innings of cell-based therapies, and I think that this is going to transform medicine. We're going to see a lot of these modalities migrate into more routine indications. When I was at FDA in 2002, if you would have come to me and said, one day we'll be using monoclonal antibodies to treat asthma and high cholesterol, I would have looked at you like you were crazy, because we didn't understand the product platforms well. They were partly murine, they were partly mouse-based, they weren't fully humanized at the time, so they weren't highly effective, they had side effects. We couldn't characterize them. We used to say the process is the product, because we couldn't understand how the monoclonal antibodies basically came out of the manufacturing process, so manufacturers were reluctant to make changes to the manufacturing process. So these drugs were largely reserved to indications like third-line cancer and other curative or settings where there was no available therapy. And then as we had more product innovation, as they became fully humanized, as we were able to characterize them better, understand their properties, understand their potential off-target effects, we started to see them migrate into more and more routine conditions, whereas to today, they're used routinely for different kinds of primary care indications. I think we're going to see the same technology curve with cell and gene therapy. It was a product innovation, much like it was the humanization of antibodies and the advent of the Medarex and the Abgenix mouse to make fully human antibody constructs that really opened up that field. It was the AAV vector, the viral vector, that allowed you to deliver gene therapy gene constructs effectively to cells and to humans that really created the modern field of cell and gene therapy. One company's innovation, everyone licenses their technology. And I think what you're going to see, and you saw it a little bit 2 weeks ago in ASCO, is cell preparations that can be off-the-shelf preparations that have the gene cassette delivered through more efficient vehicles that control better for the off-target effects, that allow for higher yield. You get more cells out of a transfection with a gene. So you're going to see the cells get more and more effective. Our ability to characterize them get better and better. Our ability to understand the durability and the potential for off-target effects and control for it get better in terms of how they're manufactured. And you're going to see off-the-shelf preparations that don't require this highly customized process to be delivered to patients. And I think as that technology curve progresses, and it could happen very rapidly, it took us sort of 15 years to get up the technology curve with the monoclonal antibodies. I think this could progress more quickly because there's a lot of economic incentives to invest in some of these new generation technologies. As this happens, I think you're going to see these move into more routine conditions, and you're also going to see the costs come down quite dramatically. So we might be at the point where we're treating heart injury and other kinds of injuries and chronic diseases like diabetes with cell therapies, as opposed to with sort of medicinal therapies that just try to manage the sort of chronic decline. We're going to have the ability to reverse it with cell therapies. If you look at right now, I would look at what Vertex is doing, and I have no relationship to them. What they're doing with cells in type 1 diabetes looks very promising. We see a lot of, obviously, applications of cell therapy in oncology, and you saw a lot of very interesting science coming out of ASCO. You're seeing interesting things in neurodegenerative diseases. Someone's going to have a breakthrough there, I think, in the near future. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities. That's the area of sort of science medicine I'd be most excited about right now.
So this sounds very exciting and a little frightening.
And very expensive, right?
And very expensive at the same time, right?
That's why he wears the tie.
So let's take this to the next level then. So, right, let's say we were able to find a transformative treatment for diabetes, hemophilia. We know there are potential curative. I mean, over the period of time that we're talking about, whether it's a short period of time. David mentioned, individuals who might shift insurance coverage. I mean, David, how are you thinking about planning for some of these big developments?
So first of all, I'm a big fan. I mean, everything he said. I believe for the next generation in America and across the world, it's critical that we do these things. But just to give you a perspective, Highmark's a Blue Cross Blue Shield plan for 4 states. And 30% of our healthcare spend on behalf of our clients, it goes to pharmaceuticals. Of that, 40% is specialty pharma or specialty care. It's only 0.6% of the claims. So you've got a real challenge as we try to figure this out in the short term. And how do we identify those value streams and figure out how to allocate and move forward with it? I think that we'll have 40% of our spend will be in the pharma space, and good. because the number one issue for us in America is chronic disease. And if we can do the diabetes and some of the other stuff, that's very powerful. In the meantime, we're using develop our organizations like Free Market Health, which is focused on matching up patients with the right specialty pharmacy to be able to deliver care. The work we're doing with CivicRx around insulin, generic insulin, to try to help get the prices down on that. Those things are going to be necessary to bridge the gap to get to the economic model that Scott talked about.
I just make one comment on that. The issue, we talk about price, and you asked about list price, and the issue isn't the price increases anymore, because the price increases, the net price is coming down, and maybe that discipline is going to be lost if some of the political pressure was lifted. So we can argue that. List prices are going up 5%, net prices are coming down. The issue is the volumes, the expanding volumes, and putting more pressure on the payers, and that's in part because the drugs are more effective. The practice of medicine has changed, where more of the practice of medicine is pharmacotherapy. I think when you think about policy solutions, though, you need to think about segmenting the market. There's a portion of the market that's highly competitive with rebating right now, where there's substantial rebating. I mean, insulin's an example of that.
Right.
There's a portion of the market where you have specialty drugs where pharmaceutical companies have monopolies, but it's very clear their monopoly is not going to be in perpetuity. They're going to lose it in a year or two. When PD-1s came on the market, or PD-L1s, Medarex, BMS had a monopoly for a year or two, and then there were fast followers, and now there's price competition. And then there's categories where you have the risk of monopolies in perpetuity, because if you have a curative gene therapy come onto the market, once you treat the prevalence population, the incidence population might not be enough to sustain second-to-market innovation. And so, you might get a second competitor, but you're not going to get a third and a fourth and a fifth, so you're not going to get that price competition entering the market. And I think we need to think about the market as sort of those three segments and think about different policy solutions for each of them, because the first part of the market is actually working. It's not a very good form of discounting the rebates, but it's actually working. Payers are getting good price concessions. Second part of the market, maybe they're not getting price concessions quickly enough. There might be things we can do. And the third part of the market is going to be a market failure, because you might have sort of natural monopolies that persist.
Right. No, and that's right. And I'm really glad that you segmented that, because there are potentially three very different solutions that you need to think about in those scenarios. So Scott, let's bring you back to your time at the FDA most recently. And I think by all accounts, you were a fantastic commissioner. I mean, you really, I think, were head and shoulders above from what we've seen, and in the middle of COVID. I mean, maybe you can just share some of your perspectives on sort of the speed with which COVID vaccines, therapies were developed, how they were deployed, and what lessons maybe we can learn from that experience of COVID to other treatment areas. How should we be thinking about that, and how can we advance our system in that way?
Yeah, look, I think the development process that we went through on the vaccines, people say it was quick, and some people who are skeptical of the vaccines point back to that as one of the reasons why they are skeptical. I'll just say up front, these were the largest outcome studies ever done in modern history, and that's not too much hyperbole, because when you look at the combined studies that Pfizer did and Moderna did and J&J did, more patients were put in randomized controlled outcome studies than for any other medical product in history. Pfizer and Moderna alone did 45,000 patient outcome studies. J&J did almost 40,000 as well. Even when you look at them individually, they were some of the largest trials ever. The only vaccine trial I ever remember being larger than that was the rotavirus vaccine, which had a very specific problem associated with it, the risk of interception, a pediatric vaccine where FDA required a very large trial for a specific reason. It was a 60,000 patient trial. So there was nothing quick about this development program. It went quick because it enrolled very quickly. People were motivated to get into the trials, and it unfortunately read out very quickly because there was so much COVID happening in the fall. They had so many cases in the placebo arm that they read out very quickly. I think that the technological inflection point that we were at, though, provided an opportunity for us to be able to pivot to these vaccines very quickly, and that is that we had modalities to give us the ability to derive vaccines through fully synthetic processes. If this was 3 years ago, we would have been making vaccines by inactivating the virus like the Chinese manufacturers did, or trying to isolate the protein and make a recombinant version that would have taken a very long period of time. If this was 4 years from now, we probably would have had these mRNA platforms and the gene therapy approach that J&J used sort of as a mainstay. Pfizer, after all, was in development of a flu vaccine with this platform at the time that it pivoted into this. But we were right at that technological inflection point and allowed us to pivot very quickly. In terms of what FDA's learnings from COVID more generally, though, I think the agency was forced to rely a lot on tools for measurement of outcomes in the home because they couldn't bring patients into clinical trial sites, so they had to rely on telemedicine visits. They had to rely on companies shipping drugs to patients and having a sort of witness them taking the drug on a telemedicine visit. They had to rely more on outcomes that were measured by the patient through tablets. In fact, we used a tablet in the Pfizer clinical trial for the vaccine. Patients were reporting their symptoms on a tablet that was given to them. So there was a lot of decoupling of the clinical trials from the physical site. And I think that is going to provide a lot of opportunity in the future because, first of all, it lowers costs. Second of all, it could allow you to recruit a much more diverse set of patients into the clinical trial. If you're no longer dependent upon sites and site-based raters for clinical trials, suddenly the whole world is your recruitment universe. And I think it's going to allow manufacturers to much more effectively target diverse communities to get more people enrolled in clinical trials who traditionally you haven't been able to reach because you were dependent on academic sites that maybe didn't do a good job reaching into broad communities. And so that, I think, is going to persist. And the other reason it's going to persist is I think regulators recognize that by doing things virtually, you actually develop a better audit trail because suddenly everything's captured electronically and you can go back and audit whether the patient took the drug. It's not just looking at a piece of paper that a physician checked off a box that the patient took it. You can actually go back and look at the tape. And you can look at how the data was inputted by the patient and look for things that look peculiar and what the outliers might be. So you now have a much more electronic audit trail that you can interrogate if you're a regulator. And I think that in certain circumstances, that's going to be preferred.
Yeah. And how about with the antivirals, right? I mean, it was pretty remarkable how quickly they also were able to come online.
Yeah, look, I mean, the story of how Paxlovid was made, I sat in a board meeting when we were sort of briefed on it, was remarkable. I mean, the sort of scientific story of how they found this molecule and refined it through all the successive waves of innovation to come up with this molecule. The monoclonal antibodies came online very quickly. I think what we learned in this pandemic is that the first line of defense against a novel virus is probably going to be the antibody-based drugs. We knew that. We should have known that. It was true in this case. I and others were saying that very early during the spring, that those were going to be on the market much earlier than the vaccines, and we ought to be investing in them and be using them sort of as an active vaccine to basically, for people who are very vulnerable, give them a dose of the monoclonal antibody. It will cover them for 3 months. But what we lacked was the capacity to manufacture those at a scale that was sufficient to distribute them broadly, and we lacked the infrastructure really to distribute them. So I think that was a big learning and a big failure in this. We should have known that. The pandemic playbook that we had sort of taught us that the antibodies were going to be the first thing that we could come up with. And then the orally available antivirals, I think you're going to see continued innovation. Pfizer has a second-generation molecule. Merck has a drug on the market. There's a lot of drugs behind that. So I think this is a highly druggable target, this coronavirus. We've never bothered to develop antivirals against coronaviruses in the past because coronaviruses were typically mild diseases. But now that we have a coronavirus that's sufficiently pathogenic that we're going to want to have antiviral drugs against it, the mechanism by which this virus replicates itself is not so complex. This isn't HIV. This is a virus that I think we're going to be able to drug very easily, and you're going to see a lot of follow-on innovation from multiple manufacturers coming to market. And that's going to give you the price competition you need.
All right.
So, David, you are in a unique position with both, the Blue Cross Blue Shield, Highmark plan, but also with, your health system, Allegheny Health Network assets. I mean, how are you thinking about sort of drugs? You mentioned in the context of the plan and that 30% now, growing to 40%, but you also think about what's happening on the hospital side. I mean, how do you balance all of these different challenges?
It's not easy, especially right now with staffing and some of the the other challenges, nurse shortages, et cetera. But honestly, we're using and very focused on our data analytics. We're taking clinical data, claims data, and we're putting it together and working with Carnegie Mellon University and finding ways to look at predictive data. We think that's very, very important, and that ultimately, and we were talking about some of the numbers, but we spend more today on pharmaceutical solutions than we do inpatient hospitalization. And so, we've reached that tipping point. That's good news. If your goal is to keep people healthy, keep them out of the hospital, and give them better, opportunities, along the way, we still have to maintain the capacity to deal with a pandemic and do other things. And that's going to require us to think differently about everything from what a nurse's role is and what they do. Where can we use artificial intelligence in terms of some of the compliance stuff that we do, and finding different ways to take care of people, different sites of care, those kinds of things. That will all be part of this solution, but you have a generation of healthcare system that was built to fight a different battle. If you go back post-World War II, not vaccinations, but accidents and infections drove a big portion of what we built as a country. Now it's chronic disease, it's other things. Advancements in surgical procedures are giving us the opportunity to do HIPs in the same day and send the patient home, with an in-home wrapper. We're going after that, and we think that those kinds of innovations will ultimately allow the marketplace to seek its own level.
He mentioned, I just want to pick up on one point. He mentioned the impact of COVID on the healthcare system. I'll just say as sort of a cautionary tale, it's kind of off topic, but I think policymakers took away some of the wrong lessons from what the healthcare system was able to do in terms of backstopping the country during COVID, and believe that there's much more capacity in the healthcare system to operate at a sort of crisis level of care than there really is if this is going to be the new norm. And you're going to see a little bit more of a cavalier attitude around rising hospitalizations from COVID, and if we have a normalized flu season this year and we have some level of a COVID season, the impact on the healthcare system could be quite substantial. And I think that there's kind of this, when I talk to policymakers, there's kind of a perception, the healthcare system can handle that. And it can handle it for a year, and maybe it handled it for 2 years, but this cannot become the new norm. We're not staffed that way.
Yep. And to that point, if you look at the first quarter, for most health systems across the country, I think there were 2 that made money. And I think we're going to have a real challenge this year as we try to work through all this, making sure that we have the capacity to deal with what is ahead of us and also come up with these different solutions. And so it's not going to be an easy journey. Most payers are getting lots of requests for rate increases. We would argue that let's invest in value-based kinds of opportunities, that are focused on outcomes and maybe, again, doing things a little differently than we've had in the past. And let's use this opportunity coming out of the pandemic for real change, not just keep propping up what we have.
And have you, David, seen any changes in patient preferences, over the past couple of years, right? In terms of, we've seen the growth in utilization of digital tools. People probably don't want to go to the hospital as much as, that they can go to other sites. I mean, how should we be thinking about sort of patient preferences, sort of writ large, and then maybe we could sort of translate that to some of the things that we're seeing with respect to more like personalized therapies and where that could be going to sort of incorporate, patient perspectives and preferences, in the drug development process.
Well, I think patient preferences have changed dramatically. Obviously during the pandemic, especially in the first 90 days, and I had the privilege of being on the front lines with the teams. By the way, I would see Scott on CNBC at 5:15 when I was in the gym, and then I'd go in and would see if everything compared. By the way, I've noticed you haven't been on there since the market went down. We got to get you working on that.
Market's in turmoil. So
yeah, we got to get you on that.
I think it's up today. So.
But I think there's no question, going into the pandemic, virtual medicine was a nice to have. And immediately it became accepted and adopted by both patients and clinicians as a tool to be able to reach people. The majority of the claims that we saw, 4 million that were virtual medicine, were behavioral health and primary care. And now what we're trying to do is expand that to specialty care. So if somebody who has a heart condition, doesn't always have to have their clinician hands-on. And we're seeing patients embrace it and love it. And I think those are the kinds of tools that we can use to maybe make a difference. I heard your speakers earlier talking about behavioral health and the shortage of staffing. There's a first layer that we can use around anxiety and depression that could be virtual or could be more technology-based. But you got to back that up with the next layer and the next layer after that in order to be able to get this right.
I'll just say, pick up on your point about your question about the FDA. There was a big effort when I was there, and this was a big area of policymaking to try to embed more patient-reported outcomes as clinical trial endpoints and allow more collection of data of how patients were experiencing a drug, how it was improving their lives, and potentially validating those as endpoints in clinical trials that could be the sort of basis of approval. And also move away from things that were very kind of episodic measures of function or outcomes to things that were more linear. So for example, the most obvious example is a trial for a drug for Duchenne's. Patient comes in and does a 5-minute walk test. You end up needing very large trials, larger than you should, because there's a lot of variability in how any patient performs on a 5-minute walk test on a treadmill on any given day. A kid could be having a bad day. It's hard to motivate them to do that. What happens if you had a biometric tool that you can put the watch, you have the Apple Watch on, you can put an Apple Watch and sort of measure how someone's performing on a daily basis. How much physical activity are they engaging in? Is it going up as a result of a therapy that's trying to improve a patient's physical performance? Those tools could be much more objective measures of the outcomes that you're trying to assess. The problem is getting regulatory agencies to validate them in a way that they're willing to accept them as an endpoint in a clinical trial. Takes a lot of investment of time, a lot of investment of capital to do the trials to validate those. We put a big effort behind that, and I think it's something, it would be good if there was sort of a broader effort in the healthcare landscape to come up with these kinds of measurements where you're measuring things that are much more likely to perceive a true improvement in the sort of endpoint of interest, and more likely to capture what's most important to patients in terms of dealing with their disease.
And are you seeing differences in terms of like how pharmaceutical companies are thinking about drug development because of this shift towards more virtual care now, and also just new technologies? I mean, or are we still like, it's still like a little too early to see any shift in terms of how maybe the biopharmaceutical innovators are thinking about?
I haven't seen a shift because of that, but what I will say is I think that there is a kind of pause happening, a recognition happening that oncology and rare diseases has become a very crowded trade. There's been a lot of capital going into those. What you've seen is that the ability to lose a franchise in the oncology space could happen overnight. Look at the data coming out of ASCO, where there was some really breakthrough data with drugs in the setting of breast cancer, and all of a sudden, and HER2 looks like it's going to obviate other therapies that used to be standard of care. So very quickly, some companies are going to lose a franchise. So I think that there is a recognition that maybe, those spaces, all the capital went to those spaces, all the venture capital went to those spaces. I obviously sit with the venture capital hat as well. And we moved away from kind of primary care because it was very competitive. There were good enough generics. And I think you're seeing a willingness to now go back into those areas: cardiovascular, neurology, migraine, diabetes, and look at whether or not there's opportunities with some of the new technologies becoming available to develop drugs that are sufficiently better than the available therapy that you can price in a way where it might be either replacing existing therapy or a slight premium over existing therapy, but you can capture enough market share with something that's going to deliver an outsized benefit over available therapy that could be an attractive franchise. And you're starting to see companies invest again in primary care, and I think that that's very healthy because, delivering a cure for a very rare cancer provides substantial public health benefit. But if you can deliver a slightly better approach to managing chronic diabetes and distribute that over a large population, that public health benefit can dwarf something that's targeting a very narrow category of patients.
That's really interesting. So we have time probably for like one more big question. And maybe I'll start with you, David. You know, we've talked a lot about innovation and some amazing developments, both in sort of acute, chronic, smaller disease populations. I mean, what do you think that we should be thinking about as a country to ensure that America, you know, remains a global leader in pharmaceutical research and innovation, but also has this affordability issue sort of top of mind?
Well, that's a tough question. I think that you know, we absolutely should allow the free markets to work. I think that's a big part of it. I mean, I don't think we want to suppress innovation. You know, I think what we've got to do is maybe prioritize the areas, as Scott was just talking about, what's important, so that we're all moving in the same direction where possible. I think that's a big part of it. And you know, and I think we've got to be willing to pay for performance. I mean, I think if an innovator comes up with something that's truly impactful, we should be prepared to pay for it. But we also have to understand there's trade-offs. You know, I mean, you either have to grow the market, or you have to, you know, take those dollars away from something else that we're sustaining. And you know, one of our challenges as a country is we like to hang on to what we have, and we keep funding in some cases what we have, and we need to find ways to reinforce that that the innovator, you know, who has an impact, you know, that they should be encouraged to develop and make things happen.
Can I just follow up on that? You know, I don't think that there's, I guess we could come up with really bad policy, but I think in the realm of the things that are being talked about that would try to address drug pricing, Grassley-Wyden, for example, you're not gonna throw this industry off a cliff. I mean, we have such a rich, vibrant biomedical industry that putting controls on the ability to take list price increases isn't going to throw this industry off a cliff. I think that the policy mistake that we could make is allowing our intellectual property to be appropriated. That's what could be devastating to the industry. But what I would say to the policies on Capitol Hill, though, is be careful what you wish for and make sure your policy is actually going to solve the challenge that you're facing. Because like Grassley-Wyden, for instance, Bernstein put out a report, a lot of drug companies would see their revenue go up or their net income go up. Their revenue might go down, but their net income would go up because of the way, the impact it would have on the rebating. So, you know, you could pass a policy solution that you think you're addressing the ostensible problem, which is the rising list prices, but you're actually not addressing the affordability question. And to me, it's not going to be one solution. It's going to be looking at the pharmaceutical marketplace in the areas where you have really vigorous competition, the areas where you don't, and trying to find solutions that introduce more competition to areas where payers really don't have a lot of price leverage, or they don't have visibility on a lot of price leverage. A company comes out with a breakthrough therapy and they have a monopoly for a year or two on that. I mean, that's rewarding the innovation, but then is there innovation coming on after that then introduces a lot of competition to the marketplace? I think that's where the challenge is right now.
I was going to, from my perspective, you know, I mean, with the policy side of it is what we've got to be careful of is the unintended consequences. You know, we like to do soundbite things and things that, you know, that feel good, but we don't understand necessarily all the other implications. You know, we've got to look at things holistically and understand that, you know, to your point, you know, I mean, if you pull a lever over here, there may be consequences in multiple places. And so at some point, you got to have a summit where we all sit down and say, let's figure this out.
And that's a great note to end on here with that. So let's figure that out. Please join me in thanking Dr. Scott Gottlieb, David Holmberg for a terrific discussion this afternoon. Just a couple of closing notes.